Good evening, and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn reporting from Washington, D.C., where temperatures have spiked near 100 degrees. The heat wave is causing havoc for our technical and video equipment. So tonight, we present a special scaled-back edition of EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, July 13th, 2017. A major development on Capitol Hill. Senate Republicans released their revised health care bill today. It includes several pro-life protections. It is unclear if Republicans will get on board. Jason Calvi has the latest from Capitol Hill. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. Only 2 Republicans can vote against this bill for it to still pass. So to attract moderates, they're adding to this new version $45 billion to help fight the opioid epidemic. And then to reach out to conservatives, they're adding an allowance to allow states to have bare bones health care plans. These have been promoted by Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. And now he says he's getting on board and supporting this new version of the bill. These plans would allow for 3 primary care visits a year, Lauren, as well as limits on out-of-pocket costs.
Tell me about the pro-life provisions, Jason. Are they still part of this new Senate bill?
They are. So there's the defunding of Planned Parenthood for 1 year of the Medicaid funds, as well as it limits those tax credits. It cannot go to any plans that cover abortion. And today I met a pro-life group that was rallying here at the Capitol. They're called Created Equal. They're made up of young adults, and they were demanding that the defunding of Planned Parenthood continue to be in the Senate plan. They also prayed just right behind me near Leader McConnell's office here at the Capitol. But I also met other faith leaders who are opposed to the Senate bill. They say it's not pro-life to kick people off of insurance. Today, late this afternoon, the U.S. bishops have come out saying that the latest Senate health care bill is still unacceptable.
Do you think that this bill is going to pass? What are you hearing?
It's going to be really hard, Lauren. Every single Democrat is opposed to this health care bill. And we've already got 2 Republicans who are no votes, and they can only afford to lose 2 Republican votes. So we've got Senator Rand Paul, conservative of Kentucky, who's against it. He says this newest version of the Republican bill is worse than the first version of the Republican health care bill. And we also have Susan Collins, a moderate from Maine, who's also a no vote. President Trump says, though, he'll be very unhappy if this bill doesn't pass.
Correspondent Jason Calvi at the Capitol. Thank you, Jason. President Donald Trump and his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, are meeting today in Paris. The 2 leaders are looking to set aside differences on trade and climate change in favor of common ground on issues like counterterrorism. Correspondent Mark Irons reports from the White House. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. The 2 presidents held a joint press conference at the French presidential palace. They acknowledged disagreements but say that won't disrupt the friendship that dates back to the American Revolution. And they identified areas where the U.S. and France can work together. Fighting terrorism and resolving the Syrian civil war are 2 of those areas.
I understand President Trump also addressed the controversy over his son Don Jr.'s meeting with a Russian attorney during last year's campaign.
That's right. The president defended his son, saying most people would have taken that meeting. He called it opposition research and said it's, quote, very standard in politics. That contradicts what his nominee to head the FBI said yesterday in testimony to Congress. Christopher Wray says Donald Trump Jr. should have alerted authorities. President Trump continues to downplay the meeting, saying, quote, nothing happened as a result.
The president also said he believes the Russian attorney was here with the approval of President Obama's Attorney General Loretta Lynch.
That's right. President Trump did say the Russian attorney was here because of former Attorney General Lynch. He clarified that statement by adding, maybe he's wrong, but that is what he had been told, Lauren.
On the Paris Climate Agreement, the French president said he understands Trump's position. But did he try to convince him to sign the deal?
Well, President Macron says he knows Trump committed to exiting the controversial agreement as one of Trump's campaign promises. The 2 leaders will meet again for dinner at the Eiffel Tower tonight, where talks will continue. President Trump said today, quote, something could happen with respect to the Paris Accord. If something happens, that would be wonderful. And if it doesn't, that would be okay too, in that quote. Lauren.
Correspondent Mark Irons at the White House. Thank you, Mark. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson wraps up a week-long tour of the Gulf states, ending the worst regional crisis in years, but there's no sign the top U.S. diplomat has been able to break a deadlock between Qatar and 4 of its neighbors. National security correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reports from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Secretary Tillerson is arriving back here in Washington tonight after playing mediator between U.S. allies in the Persian Gulf. State Department officials here say Tillerson is taking an important step towards easing tension between Qatar and its neighbors. But officials here have been downplaying any expectations that could solve the crisis this week. They say a resolution could be months away. All this after Secretary Tillerson has been shuttling between Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait since Monday, trying to break the impasse. Tillerson didn't take any questions while in Qatar today, but has been saying he is hopeful they can find a solution. Lauren?
Wyatt, there's been a long-standing frustration among Gulf states with Qatar. What is the central problem?
Well, Lauren, 4 countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Bahrain, all accuse Doha of supporting terrorism by funding extremist groups. Qatar is denying those claims, but its neighbors say this has been going on for years now. So on June 5th, they severed ties with Qatar and closed their borders. So there's not allowed, no Qatari citizens are allowed to enter their countries, but the countries gave Qatar a list of 13 demands, including shutting down Qatar's Al Jazeera network, cutting ties with Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and limiting its ties with Iran.
You were just at the State Department press briefing. It wrapped up just a little while ago. Did they have any update on the negotiations?
Well, the State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert was pushed on this issue and pressed on what concrete goals had come as a result of Secretary Tillerson's trip, and she used this phrase, subtle progress, and she said that's what had been accomplished, subtle progress, that seemed to frustrate some members of the media who were hoping to get a little bit more information. They wanted to get a concrete framework for what exactly was going to happen next and the next steps for Secretary Tillerson. But she says the point of this, again, to reiterate, was not to solve all of the crisis this week, but to open up lines of dialogue. And she said that was started to accomplish this week, and she said that was the goal. At least subtle progress is better than no progress at all. Lauren?
I understand there was an update today from Special Envoy Brett McGurk on the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Tell us about that.
Yes, Lauren, Brett McGurk serves as an envoy to the wider coalition against ISIS. So he congratulated the Iraqi military and the Kurdish Peshmerga forces for their victory against ISIS in Mosul. The military, backed by the U.S.-led coalition, announced they had liberated the city this weekend after it was held by ISIS for more than 3 years. So after it was held by ISIS, McGurk acknowledged that more work now lies ahead in order to rebuild, which is why he announced today that the U.S. is going to pledge $119 million more to humanitarian aid. Now, separately today, he also said there's ongoing ceasefire in southwest Syria has been a success. He says they're working with Russia and Jordan on this issue, which he says has been an important step towards possibly solving the bloody civil war there. Lauren?
We're going to talk to a congressman later in the show who says he doesn't think the ceasefire is going to work in the future, and we'll talk about that. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee at the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. Italy is threatening to close ports to aid groups rescuing refugees off of Libya's coast. The high rate of rescues in the Mediterranean Sea is astonishing. Joining us now is Gerardo Solaro del Borgo, president of the Italian Relief Corps of the Order of Malta. How is your order helping refugees? Are you still going to be able to do this if Italy blocks groups from Italian ports?
Yes, we will be able, because at the moment we are on board of the Italian Coast Guard boats, and in this activity we will always be active in the stretch of sea which is south of Italy, where all the immigrants are coming. We are on board of the search and rescue boats, and it will be always the responsibility of the Italian Coast Guard to safeguard the people that are crossing that stretch of sea. So we are on the Italian Navy boats, and therefore the fact that the Italian ports would be closed doesn't affect obviously the Italian Navy boats.
Your rescue teams in the southern Mediterranean are some of the first to reach refugees. What kind of situations do you see?
Well, unfortunately, we see the most dramatic things on these boats, because people are suffering of burns. They have not been eating and drinking for many, many hours. And in the heat of these days, we unfortunately find sometimes also some people that have lost their lives. but mainly people that are suffering of heavy burns, because the combination of salt water and petrol really affects the bodies in a dramatic way.
The Order of Malta is the oldest Christian medical mission group in the world. Tell me, what are the most critical medical needs of these refugees? How can they be helped?
Well, actually, the first thing that we have to do is to cure the burns. So we bring them on board of our Navy ships, and we start to cure all the burns they have. And sometimes when we have 100 people on board, 70 to 80% really suffer of burns all over the body, and therefore the main activity is to relieve the suffering.
Gerardo, Catholic teaching on immigration is to welcome the immigrant, but also uphold the law. How do you balance that in your work?
Well, the Order of Malta looks more on the activity of safeguarding the people and welcoming the people. It's not our activity of neither being political, neither being a police corps. So what we do and what we have to do is just to welcome the people, safeguarding and making sure they are well, and that is our main aim. We leave it to the Coast Guard, to the Italian police, and to the politicians to make the politics and to decide what is right and what is wrong under that area.
Thank you so much, Gerardo Solaro del Borgo, President of the Italian Relief Corps of the Order of Malta. We'll have more coming up in just a moment. Welcome back to a scaled-back version of EWTN News Nightly for July 13th, 2017. You'll notice we have very few graphics this evening. Our ability to show you video of the day's events is limited. Our next guest is Congressman Mike Gallagher, a Republican from Wisconsin. He served for 7 years in the United States Marine Corps and deployed twice to Iraq. In addition to that, he has a PhD in international relations. Now, before leaving for France, President Trump told Reuters he wasn't aware his son met with a Russian lawyer until just a few days ago. Congressman, you have been very vocal about the relationship between the White House and Russia. What do you make of this latest revelation?
Well, I think it's serious. And I think before tearing each other apart, let's recognize that 3 investigations are underway. We have one in the House, one in the Senate. We obviously have the special investigation being led by Robert Mueller. And I think let's allow that to proceed. Let's get all the facts. What I've said from the beginning is we want the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Let the facts and the truth set us free. But I think looking more broadly, we need to be very, very wary about the Russians and recognize that Putin does not share our long-term interests. The Russians have launched an influence campaign against our own democracy, corresponding with cyber attacks that they've launched around the world. They've invaded a sovereign country, redrawn the borders of Europe at gunpoint for the first time since World War II. They don't share our interest in the Middle East. They've repeatedly violated and crossed our red lines in Syria and more broadly. So I think it's a fantasy to believe that we can work with the Russians. I think any grand bargain with the Russians on counterterrorism cooperation would be short-sighted and would cede a Russian and Iranian sphere of influence in the Middle East. That would be disastrous for our own interests, disastrous for our allies, and ultimately make our homeland less secure.
You've called for the House to pass legislation on economic sanctions against Russia that the Senate did pass. What impact would these sanctions have on our relationship with Russia?
Well, listen, I think the Senate passed it 98-2, so it's incumbent upon the House to act now. And it's not just Russia sanctions. These are Iranian sanctions as well. We know that the Iranians continue their support for terrorist groups around the world. They're the leading state sponsor of terrorism. They continue to meddle in Syria. They threaten our closest ally in the Middle East, Israel, with an expanding ballistic missile program in contravention of no less than 6 UN Security Council resolutions. So I think it's perfectly fair to pass enhanced sanctions on Iran for this illicit and dangerous activity. And there are many of us who believe that Iran is also in violation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and we need to enforce it more strongly. So I think there's a strong case to be made. As for how it affects our relations with the Russians, what the Russians respond to more than anything else is strength, not weakness. For too long now, for the last 8 years, we've shown nothing but weakness, and the Russians have continued to test our limits. So my concern is that when we show greater weakness, when we have a ceasefire in one part of Syria, it allows the Russians and the Iranians to regroup and move their shock troops to other parts of the country and actually gain more territory. And we saw that time and again in the last administration, and we cannot repeat those same mistakes. We have to be willing to stand up, and it starts in the House with sanctions.
Are you saying then that the ceasefire is not a good idea?
I'm thinking that we need to be very, very careful. Let's evaluate the ceasefire. In the past, whenever Assad has agreed to a ceasefire, this is more directly between us and the Russians, there's been violations of it. There's also been reports in the last 24 hours that they've violated. If the ceasefire means that we are ceding a sphere of influence to Russia and Iran, then yes, it is a very bad idea, because the longer-term threat, ISIS is the urgent threat we face in Syria, and we cannot allow it to have a caliphate. We cannot allow it to have a terrorist safe haven in the heart of the Middle East. But in many ways, Iran is the more pressing and longer-term threat. Iran is a greater threat to all our allies in the region. And as H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, said the other week, something like 70% of the pro-regime forces on the ground in Syria are actually Iranian-backed militias and Iranian-backed terrorist groups like Hezbollah. Hezbollah presents an enormous threat to Israel and has made significant advances in its missile capability. So we have to orient our Syria policy as well as our broader regional policy along the lines of rolling back Iranian influence and making sure that it doesn't develop a nuclear capability, which this deal will allow it to do in 10 years if we don't reverse the disastrous terms of the deal. And so if the ceasefire means that we are going to continue the mistakes of the past and allow Russia and Iran to establish an axis of influence around the Middle East, then we should rethink it, and we should be clear-eyed about who we're dealing with in Moscow.
Thank you for your time, Congressman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin. And coming up next, our analysts will talk about the day's news, plus we will have an update on the 11-month-old Charlie Gard. Welcome back to EWTN News Nightly for July 13th, 2017. You'll notice we have very few graphics this evening. Our show is not able to show you a lot of video. That's thanks to the heat wave here and some technical difficulties. Our next guests are here to help us understand how the Senate's new health care bill will affect Americans. Bob Cusack, editor-in-chief for The Hill. Jim Ansell, the politics editor at the Washington Examiner. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thank you.
There is a lot packed into that 172-page legislation introduced on the Hill today for health care. More help for out-of-pocket expenses, health savings accounts to pay for premiums, additional resources, I think, what, $45 billion to combat the opioid epidemic. How's this bill going to fare?
I don't think it's not different enough, and we've seen the centrists like Susan Collins and the conservative side like Rand Paul indicating they have not gotten to yes, and a lot of the moderates have not gotten to yes. So I don't think the Republicans are pushing this extremely hard. I think actually they know they can't get the votes and they want to move on to something else. So I don't think they're going to get the votes here.
Jim, you've been covering politics for a while. Are you in agreement with Bob? And even, my question really is, though, even though it looks like there is a lot of options in here for them to buy lower premium plans.
Well, the big thing is how many conservatives can they get to vote for it, and then will they be able to, with the money, by not doing the tax cut, quite as big of a tax cut, with that money they now have to play with that they haven't all spent with the new things they've added, will they be able to sort of buy off some of the moderates and get them to vote for it? That's really their option in the Senate. But I think the difficulty is you still have a lot of people who are unsure that this is what the bill will look like in its final form when they vote to proceed with debate and consideration of it. And then are you voting for something that will blow up again in the House? So are you taking this risky vote and then it might not be able to pass the House, and so you have nothing to show for it?
Well, the problem, Bob, is that they haven't been able to pass this in, what are we at now, 7 months into, almost 7 months into the, or 6 months into the administration. And it seems as if the momentum is gone, even though they're extending their August vacation and recess until the, until the 14th.
Yeah, there's no momentum here. And the other factor here is a lot of Republican governors have expressed major concerns with the Medicaid provisions. So this party is divided. We interviewed Mitch McConnell earlier this year, and he said, if we're united, we're going to win. Basically, we're going to pass our agenda. They're not united, and they're not winning. And that's why I think the odds are against them on health care. And I think McConnell wants to move to tax reform and tax cuts very quickly.
And I don't know why they think that they would be able to do well with tax reform if they can't get health care. All right, let's move on. Some international news. French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife hosted President Trump this evening in an exclusive Eiffel Tower restaurant. Are they an odd couple, do you believe, for diplomatic relations?
They're a very odd couple. I mean, President Trump was elected as part of what a lot of people think is a Western nationalist wave that Macron kind of bucked. And the president was not seeming to be a fan of his during the campaign, even though he said after he was elected that Macron was his guy. But they do seem to have established a little bit of a rapport. Obviously, they have significant differences, particularly on the Paris Climate Accord.
Right,
but
and
their sort of personal relationship does seem to be a little bit better than what we might have expected.
before we go, we don't have much time. Bob, I want to talk to you about these press briefings. Veteran journalists are up in arms about the fact that we haven't seen the president since last month, and yet he's giving press briefings in foreign countries. What do you think's going on with the White House?
Well, I think we know that the president has been disappointed with his communication shop. He has said that publicly. So
Sean Spicer isn't on this trip.
That's right. And we haven't seen on-camera briefings. And I think actually that hurts the White House because they're not using the bully pulpit as effectively as they should be. They're doing these off-camera things. It's very odd. It's what they can do. They run the White House. But at the same time, maybe that's part of the reason that they haven't been able to get their agenda done on Capitol Hill.
All right. Bob Cusack, editor-in-chief of The Hill, thank you for joining me. Jim Antle, politics editor at The Washington Examiner. In court testimony, an American doctor says it's worth trying an experimental therapy to help Charlie Gard. He's the 11-month-old British baby at the center of an international debate. Charlie's parents have been fighting to get treatment in the U.S. for their son, but they've been blocked by the British hospital and courts. The judge today said he won't continue hearing the case unless the American doctor comes to London to see Charlie and meet other healthcare experts. International support for Charlie Gard continues to grow, including right here in Washington. 2 lawmakers are introducing legislation to support the baby boy, and one is Representative Brad Wenstrup of Ohio. He joins me now. Tell me, why did you do this?
Well, I saw that there was a need and an opportunity. It was really a combination of both. Here you have a young infant who has a debilitating disease with the possibility of a cure, but he's being denied. You know, the thing that was really amazing to me is this is against the parents' wishes. The parents' desire to try and establish more treatment, and this is being denied. And what amazes me even more is that this is what doctors are advising. And I think that goes against the grain of what it means to be a doctor, especially if there is a potential opportunity for a cure out there. In many ways, this is personal to me because of a family experience.
Well, tell me more about that, your personal story that inspired you to write the legislation.
Well, about 23 years ago, my sister, at 26 years old, I was 36, she developed leukemia. And the doctors told her that without treatment, she was going to die, and even with treatment she might, but her best chance is with a bone marrow transplant. When it came time to do a bone marrow transplant, her insurance company said it was experimental, and we're not going to allow that. Her doctors didn't advise that. They suggested she do it and go to Seattle to do it, which we did. It's now 23 years later. She is a wife, a mother of 2, and is doing very well. So to hear that this is experimental and shouldn't be tried really bothered me.
In court today, the family had a lot of difficulty, and they walked out at one point. They're very upset. What do you think the outcome is going to be, based on the fact that the judge has already said Charlie Gard must die?
Yeah, I find that unbelievable that that's the decision they would make against a patient or against a patient's parents in this case, when there is an outside chance of hope or a chance of hope. That really is intriguing to me. And although these doctors may be very brilliant in many ways, I think that we are better served with the notion that a cure begins with one. And if we never try, we're never going to get a cure. And Charlie has this opportunity. And it's, you know, as I told my sister when she was sick and they were including her in studies and she was asking me whether she should be in them, I said, yes, you should be. And somebody was in studies before you, and that's why you have a fighting chance today. This child has a fighting chance, and we should give that to him. And they're raising the money privately to be able to do it.
Thank you so much for joining us, Congressman Brad Wenstrup of Ohio. And that does it for us at EWTN News Nightly. To all of you around the world, I'm Lauren Ashburn. Good night, and God bless you.